Imagine being tasked to dig the earth for someone else's death, and realizing the next grave you dig might be for the very man who ordered your chains. Between 1857 and 1859, 12 of the wealthiest plantation owners in southern Louisiana simply disappeared. Not missing, vanished. Their estates untouched. Their families bewildered. Officially, they were said to have fled westward to Texas or beyond. But the truth, the one that whispers through the swamps and cypress shadows, is far darker. Solomon Tibido, a freedman born into the swamp and bound to its brutal rhythms, knew their fates long before anyone else did. He was no ordinary gravedigger. Tall, broad-shouldered, and silent, Solomon had inherited the sacred and secretive craft from his father, Jean-Baptiste Tibido, a man who taught him that death demanded respect even from those who lived only to inflict pain. By 40, Solomon had become indispensable to the parish. White families trusted him to prepare graves. Priests relied on him to maintain church cemeteries. And yet, he listened to everything. Every whispered sin, every confession, every secret the living thought buried. The swamps themselves seemed to conspire with him. Black waters stretched endlessly, cypress knees jutted like rotten teeth, and fog rolled thick enough to choke. Men unfamiliar with the bayou wandered in circles, swallowed by shadows, leaving only rumors of their fate. Solomon knew every dry path, every hidden landing, every escape from eyes that would watch too closely. But he also knew something more profound. Cruelty leaves a mark. He had observed, over years, the plantation master's obsessive punishments, the dehumanizing rituals, the experiments in suffering that pushed beyond reason. He remembered every scream, every plea ignored, every back broken for sport. It was not vengeance, at least not at first, that drove him. It was calculation, patience honed over decades of enforced submission. He dug holes for the living, for the dead, for the enslaved, and for the ones who thought themselves untouchable. 12 men, measured, observed, hunted, and buried alive in the very soil they had believed they owned. And while the authorities closed their files with neat, bureaucratic finality, the swamp remembered. The families whispered, and Solomon, he waited, silently, in plain sight. This is not a story about simple revenge. It is a story about power, the hidden power of one man who learned to bend the system without ever touching it. One man who held knowledge the masters never imagined they could lose control over. And the more we descend, the more you will see. History is not written by the victors alone. Sometimes it is buried, inch by inch, in the darkness, beneath the weight of soil and silence. Solomon was born in 1817, a child suspended between two worlds. His father, a freed Creole man, and his mother, enslaved. Legally, he was free, yet in the parishes of Terrebonne and Lafarge, freedom was measured in inches, not law. Every step, every word, every gesture had rules written in fear and unspoken codes. To survive, he had to learn patience, silence, and observation, not just as survival but as armor. From his father, he inherited the sacred knowledge of the grave. But he also inherited something else. Awareness of the subtle hierarchies, the lies everyone accepted as truth, and the machinery of human cruelty that worked quietly, invisibly, beneath polite society. He learned to move through the swamp like a shadow, to measure the currents of human behavior with the precision of a craftsman. Every plantation, every overseer, every worker he cataloged. He watched as men wielded power with casual violence, as families were broken, as flesh and spirit were bent to the will of wealth. The sugar fields demanded obedience, and Solomon understood obedience was often purchased with fear. But he also understood that fear can be inverted. Fear can be redirected. Fear can be used against those who wield it blindly. The cypress swamps were his domain. Where others saw mud, water, and hanging moss, he saw maps. Dry islands became safe passages, deep water concealed movements, and fog became a veil to hide from prying eyes. He knew which paths could lead to safety and which could lead to disappearance. And in this mastery, he built his silent empire not with money, not with weapons, but with knowledge that no authority could touch. And yet, even in mastery, patience was his cruelest tool. He was not the kind to strike immediately. He measured. He waited. He observed how cruelty shaped men, how it revealed weakness and arrogance. The 12 plantation owners who would vanish did not notice the pattern forming. Each visit to a field, each request for a grave dug, each whispered secret they unknowingly offered to him he recorded. Their deaths were not random. They were the culmination of a long, careful study of human behavior. This is where most histories fail. They record facts, dates, and official verdicts. They ignore the quiet forces that shape outcomes: the invisible hand, the silent observer, the patient mind. Solomon was more than a gravedigger. He was a custodian of secrets, a master of observation, and ultimately, an arbiter of judgment in a world that allowed men to think they were untouchable. And here is where I ask you to pause. Write in the comments, twice, "I see what is hidden." Do this not for me, not for anyone, but for yourself. To mark that you are ready to descend further, that your mind is prepared to hold truths most fear to acknowledge. The swamp is patient. Knowledge is patient. And those who dare to hold it must prove their intent. The first disappearances were quiet, almost imperceptible. No alarms, no witnesses, just the subtle erasure of men who believed themselves untouchable. Solomon did not strike with violence. He struck with inevitability. He had studied them for years. The tilt of a chin when pride swelled, the twitch of a hand when cruelty became performative, the complacency of those who believed the world would always bend to their will. He knew exactly where to place each man, exactly how to make the earth swallow them without leaving trace. The swamp itself became his accomplice. Cypress knees concealed steps, black water swallowed weight, and fog muffled sound. A plantation owner could walk 100 yards from his fields and vanish as if the ground had opened to claim him. And in a way it had. Solomon dug, yes, but he measured first. He prepared the space while his victims were still alive, still arrogant, still unaware. The whole became a silent witness to their arrogance, a mirror to their sins. And when the moment came, the transition from life to oblivion was as seamless as turning the soil with a spade. No one suspected Solomon. He was too reliable, too steady, too invisible. Authorities dismissed the disappearances as migration, as accidents, as random tragedies. Plantation families grieved, puzzled, powerless. But those who whispered in the night, the enslaved, the freedmen, the few who knew better. Solomon had become more than a man. He had become a reckoning. A slow, deliberate, measured force that could undo the lives of those who thought themselves beyond judgment. The psychological control he wielded was subtle. He never boasted, never threatened. But the owner's fear would have been enough if they had only sensed it. He understood human behavior in its rawest form. Pride breaks faster than bones, arrogance blinds, cruelty isolates. Each vanishing was not just a punishment, it was a lesson written in silence. A warning that knowledge is power, patience is power, and the underestimated can wield forces the mighty cannot even imagine. Yet Solomon's work carried an almost sacred ritual. Every grave was prepared with care, the soil compacted just so, markers aligned, boundaries respected. Even in retribution there was order. The swamp, the man, and the act itself became a dance of inevitability, choreographed over years of observation. It was meticulous, deliberate, and, above all, secret. The disappearing men left no trace, not because Solomon wanted to hide them from justice, but because in that world, justice was already being served where no law could reach. And here the darkness deepens. The stakes are no longer just survival, they are transformation. Those who witness, who understand, who pay attention, cannot remain the same. Their perception of power, control, and morality is altered forever. You are part of this now. You are watching, thinking, understanding. And the deeper you look, the more dangerous the knowledge becomes, not for Solomon, but for those who cling to ignorance. Solomon's mastery was not brute force. It was architecture, mental, spatial, and moral. The swamp was his canvas, and human behavior his medium. Every path through the bayou, every small island, every shallow waterway, he knew as intimately as the lines on his own hands. He could predict where a man would hesitate, where he would panic, where he would stumble. The plantation owners believed themselves in control of land, labor, and law, but Solomon controlled perception itself. Fear was his ally and time his weapon. He studied routines, habits, even idiosyncrasies. A master who rose early to inspect the cane fields. A man who left his boots in the same place every night. A family who held private prayers at the same hour. Each detail became a thread he wove into his plan. He knew which men would underestimate the swamp, which would dismiss the warnings of the enslaved, which would believe that wealth and authority could outrun death. And when the moment came, the disappearance was never violent, it was surgical. The environment did the work, and the hole in the ground became a silent accomplice to history itself. Yet Solomon was also patient with the human mind. He would plant subtle cues. A misplaced object, a half-heard whisper, the rustle of water in an empty canal. These small disturbances were enough to unsettle a man who trusted in order and control. He understood something profound. When a person believes the world is predictable, every anomaly becomes a trap for the imagination. Anxiety grows, paranoia blooms, and in that fertile soil, a master can be undone without a single lash. The enslaved people watched quietly. They whispered of Solomon's foresight, his knowledge of paths and hearts. They knew he listened, that he recorded, that he remembered. His power did not come from overt rebellion. It came from the silent accumulation of truth, from knowing what the masters did not. The irony was bitter. The men who ruled the plantations with violence were powerless against a man who wielded knowledge as both shield and sword. It is here that the moral gravity of his work becomes clear. These 12 men, each guilty of unimaginable cruelty, each confident in the permanence of their dominion, were undone not by weapons, but by the combination of patience, observation, and environmental mastery. Solomon's actions were precise, inevitable, and irreversible. They were acts of retribution, yes, but also a demonstration of a principle most men never learn: that control is an illusion, and that the unseen, silent observer may hold the ultimate power. And now, as you watch and listen, understand this: knowing is not passive. Observation changes the observer. Awareness alters perception. To follow Solomon's path is not just to witness history, it is to confront the mechanisms of power, the fragility of arrogance, and the potential for one individual to turn oppression into justice, in ways history has tried to erase. By the time Solomon reached the age of 42, the pattern was no longer subtle, it was undeniable to those who watched closely. 12 men vanished from the swamps, leaving only rumors and haunted whispers behind. Each disappearance was a lesson etched in silence, each absence a warning to the arrogant. He had become something more than a gravedigger. He was an arbiter of the swamp, a quiet executor of a balance that no law, no plantation, no priest could touch. The sugar parishes had their own justice, and it was being dispensed in the dark, where the water was thick and the moss hung like judgment. The method was meticulous. Solomon never acted without preparation. He studied the rhythms of each man, the exact hour they left their estate, the habits of their overseers, the paths they took to inspect their slaves or their sugar fields. He observed which men laughed at warnings, which ignored advice, which relied on the arrogance of wealth. These details determined how, when, and where the earth would receive them. The holes he dug in advance were more than graves, they were instruments of inevitability, carefully measured, silently awaiting the final act. And yet, Solomon did not act alone in spirit. He was accompanied by the memories of centuries of oppression, by the knowledge whispered to him by the enslaved who knew all too well the limits of freedom. Every scream they had endured, every family torn apart, every injustice unpunished became a layer in his calculation. He knew that the master's power relied on fear, but fear could be redirected. Fear could be inverted. Fear could become a chain that bound them to their own demise, without them even realizing it until the moment was too late. What makes this story darker still is how normal it appeared on the surface. Solomon remained the dutiful gravedigger. He prepared funerals, repaired headstones, offered small kindnesses that cost him nothing but revealed his competence. No one suspected that the very same hands that handled the bodies of the dead were plotting the fates of the living. To the outside world, he was a man of routine and discretion. To the swamp, he was a force of precision, a silent judge, a historian of cruelty, writing sentences in soil. This is the point where we realize something profound. The mechanism of power is rarely visible. It is subtle, hidden in patterns, in timing, in knowledge of the environment and human psychology. Solomon's acts were extreme, yes, but they illuminate a truth that transcends the bayou. Those who underestimate the quiet, who dismiss the unseen observer, who ignore the patience of a measured mind, will inevitably fall. Power is not held by force alone, it is held by understanding, by calculation, and by the courage to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And now, remember what I asked earlier. In the comments, twice, write, "I see what is hidden," not as a game but as a seal of your awareness. Because by this point, you are no longer just a witness. You are a participant in understanding forces most dare not name, a participant in a knowledge that has always been deliberately obscured. By now, the parishes themselves had become extensions of Solomon's design. He moved through them like a shadow that knew every secret, every crack in the veneer of power. The plantation owners believed themselves untouchable, ruling their sugar empires with whips, chains, and fear, but Solomon had discovered the unseen axis upon which their world turned. It was not muscle, nor wealth, nor authority. It was knowledge, patience, and observation, and he wielded it like a blade sharper than any sword. He watched how greed and arrogance blinded the powerful. Jack Adair, Emil Browser, and the others all thought they could manipulate every life around them, that wealth could protect them from consequence. But Solomon had studied them for years. He knew which men would hesitate, which would rage, which would stumble. Every decision they made became part of the architecture of their own undoing. And he did not intervene openly. He allowed the swamp, the fog, the darkness, and their own hubris to conspire. He was invisible but omnipresent. The enslaved population, the ones who had suffered under these men, whispered about him in secret, recognizing a force that was both protector and avenger. To them, Solomon was more than human. He was a guardian of balance, a silent executor of justice where none existed. They saw what the white families could not. A man who could bend the world with his mind, who could orchestrate terror without raising his hand. And as he moved from estate to estate, digging, preparing, observing, he accumulated not just knowledge of paths and people, but knowledge of hearts, of weakness, of the corruption that wealth and power create in isolation. This is where history itself bends. Court records, letters, and official documents do not tell you this. They hide it. They record the dates, the missing men, the abandoned inquiries, but they do not record the truth. That one man, using silence and observation alone, could disrupt a system so rigid that it believed itself permanent. Solomon's mastery was psychological. He weaponized anticipation, uncertainty, and fear. Each plantation owner became a subject in an experiment of inevitability, never realizing the forces aligning against them were as precise as the graves he had dug. And now you must understand something crucial. Knowledge changes the observer. To watch, to understand, to grasp what Solomon achieved is not passive. Your perception of power, of authority, of control itself is being rewritten. You are beginning to see how systems can be manipulated, how arrogance blinds, how patience and subtlety are more terrifying than any overt act of violence. This is the forbidden understanding that history suppresses, the kind of awareness that changes the way a man moves through the world. Forever. The final disappearances were not hurried. They were inevitable, the culmination of years of observation, calculation, and silence. Solomon had studied 12 men, their routines, their habits, their arrogance. He knew exactly how each would respond when confronted with uncertainty, with the unknown. The swamp, ever patient, became an accomplice to the design. Fog rolled thick, black waters hid movement, and cypress roots rose like the teeth of the earth itself. It was in this world that justice, invisible yet absolute, was delivered. Each man walked the paths he had known all his life, confident in ownership, confident in control. But Solomon had altered the map, reshaped the environment, and manipulated perception so subtly that their own arrogance became their undoing. One by one, they vanished. No struggle, no screams carried beyond the water and moss. Only the faint ripple of disturbance in the black water, a subtle collapse in the soil, a final emptiness where pride once walked. And the swamp kept its secrets, as it had for centuries, while Solomon remained a man among men, silent, unremarkable, yet untouchable. The horror was not in the act itself, but in the inevitability. These men had lived by cruelty, assuming dominion over life itself. And yet, the power they wielded so casually was meaningless against a mind that understood consequence, patience, and environment. Solomon's acts were surgical, every movement precise, every disappearance preordained. It was as if the land itself had risen in judgment, guided by a single, disciplined intelligence. The parish records would never tell this truth. They would not record the holes dug before life ended, the calculation, the orchestration, the invisible web that bound all 12 to their fates. Only whispers, only legend, only fear carried the memory forward. And here you must recognize what is happening to you as you listen. The story is not just of Solomon, it is of power, of control, of the unseen forces that shape outcomes. You are beginning to see patterns hidden in plain sight, to recognize manipulation in what others consider randomness, to understand that authority is fragile when confronted with knowledge and patience. By witnessing this, your perception of history, of human behavior, of your own potential is being altered. This is the forbidden truth that those in power would prefer you never learn. The swamp did not judge indiscriminately. Solomon did not kill out of rage or malice. He acted with method, with purpose, with a sense of cosmic balance. And in this, there is a lesson you cannot ignore. One man, armed with observation, knowledge, and patience, can reshape reality itself. Fear is a tool, patience a weapon, and the unseen observer holds power beyond any authority. This is the knowledge that changes men, the kind of understanding that cannot be unlearned, the darkness that leaves a permanent imprint on the mind. When the last of the 12 plantation owners vanished, the swamp returned to its stillness, as if nothing had happened. Yet everything had changed. Solomon stood in silence, as he always did, observing the aftermath of events that no official record would ever capture. Graves had been dug, not in haste, but in patient preparation. Disappearances executed, not in violence, but in precise inevitability. The land had swallowed arrogance, cruelty, and ignorance, and in doing so, it whispered a lesson that would never be written in textbooks, only remembered in shadowed stories passed quietly among those who knew how to see. The parish authorities, after 17 interviews with Solomon, closed their inquiries abruptly. Migration to Texas, they claimed. Simple, convenient, and entirely false. No one questioned the absence of estate sales, the lack of correspondence, the unbroken lines of inheritance, all evidence buried beneath bureaucratic closure. But the enslaved and freedmen knew. They carried the memory of Solomon's work in whispers, in nods, in glances toward paths through the cypress that led to nothing or everything. The myth of Solomon Tibido was born from truth, and truth, in this case, was lethal. This story is not one of vengeance alone. It is a study of power, patience, and the precision of the unseen. Solomon's methods were psychological as much as physical. He manipulated environment, perception, and expectation, bending the arrogance of men to the inevitability of their own reckoning. The swamp was his partner, silence his instrument, knowledge his weapon. 12 men believed themselves beyond consequence, and yet each fell, not through chaos, but through the careful, deliberate orchestration of a mind attuned to systems and human frailty. And this is why it matters to you. What you have witnessed is not merely history, it is a template. Observe the patterns in the world, understand the environment, the behaviors, the hidden hierarchies. Recognize the arrogance of those in control, the blind faith of those who assume permanence. Knowledge is the ultimate leverage. Patience is the ultimate weapon. And the unseen, disciplined observer is the ultimate power. The swamp still remembers, still whispers, still waits. So does Solomon, though history has tried to forget him. His lessons are embedded in the darkness. Power is fragile, arrogance is fatal, and the mind that sees beyond surface appearances can reshape reality itself. You are no longer a passive witness. By understanding, by following, by seeing what others overlook, you are changed. The forbidden knowledge has entered your awareness. You can never unsee it, and your world will never look the same again. This is the end of the story, but not the end of its effect. Carry it with you. Watch the shadows differently. Measure your own world as carefully as Solomon measured the swamp. And remember, true power always begins where others believe control is absolute. If you think you can face the truths they tried to erase, write in the comments. Twice, I see what is hidden. Subscribe, hit the bell, and journey further into the forbidden histories the textbooks won't touch. This is not just a story, it's knowledge that changes you forever.